The air inside the Cadillac Escalade was thick with the scent of leather and Lillian Hayes's faint perfume, a sharp, floral note that cut through the hum of Atlanta's evening traffic. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening as I navigated the last turn onto Peachtree Street. The dashboard clock glowed 6:47 p.m., and the meeting with the Hayes Dynamics board was set for 7:30. Plenty of time, I told myself, though the knot in my gut suggested otherwise. Lillian sat beside me, her navy blazer crisp against the cream upholstery, her fingers tapping idly on the edge of her briefcase. She didn't speak, but I could feel her presence like a weight, steady, commanding, the kind of aura that made men like me sit straighter. "James, pull over up ahead," she said suddenly, her voice low but firm, breaking the silence like a judge's gavel. "I need a coffee. The 7-Eleven's fine." I glanced at her, surprised. "We've got time, but the office has a machine." "I'd rather not drink sludge from a boardroom Keurig," she cut in, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Besides, I need to stretch my legs. You could use it too. You've been tense since we left the house." She wasn't wrong. I'd been on edge all day, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the weight of driving her, a woman who owned half the city's skyline, through streets that felt less safe every year. Or maybe it was the whispers I'd caught at the last board meeting, hints of a power shuffle that could leave me out in the cold. I was her driver, her fixer, her shadow, but shadows don't last when the light shifts. I eased the SUV into the 7-Eleven parking lot, the neon sign buzzing overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow across the cracked asphalt. The place was a dump, graffiti scrawled on the brick walls, a dumpster overflowing in the corner, but it was quiet, save for the hum of traffic a block away. I killed the engine and stepped out, the humid Georgia air hitting me like a damp towel. Lillian followed, her heels clicking against the pavement as she adjusted her blazer. She looked out of place here, a queen stepping into a pawn shop, and I felt that familiar twitch of unease again. "Black, no sugar," she said, handing me a $10 bill. "And get yourself something. You look like you're about to snap." I nodded, pocketing the cash, and watched her lean against the car, pulling out her phone. She was 42, 10 years my senior, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. I'd been with her for 3 years now, long enough to know she didn't need me to protect her, but short enough that I still felt the urge to try. Inside, the clerk barely looked up from his phone as I grabbed 2 coffees from the machine. The place smelled of stale donuts and burnt grounds, and the fluorescent lights flickered like they were on their last legs. I paid, stepped back into the muggy night, and froze. 3 figures stood near the Escalade, their shadows stretching long under the streetlights. They were young, mid-20s, maybe, dressed in hoodies and jeans that hung too low. One leaned against the hood, his boots scuffing the paint, while the other two flanked Lillian, who hadn't moved from her spot. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. My pulse kicked up, a dull thud in my ears. "Nice ride, lady," the one on the hood was saying as I approached. His voice was rough, edged with a drawl that didn't quite hide the menace. "What's a woman like you doing out here?" "Lost? I'm exactly where I need to be," Lillian replied, her tone cool, like she was addressing a subordinate. "You, on the other hand, seem to be in my way." He laughed, a sharp bark that made my grip tighten on the coffee cups. I stepped closer, catching sight of his face, sharp jaw, eyes too bright, like he was wired on something. The name stitched on his jacket read Travis. The other two shifted, one cracking his knuckles, the other eyeing me like I was a problem he'd enjoy solving. "James," Lillian said, evenly, not taking her eyes off Travis. "You're just in time. Everything okay?" I asked, setting the coffees on the roof of the car. My voice was steady, but my hand hovered near my jacket pocket, where I kept a folding knife I hadn't used in years. Not since the old days, before Lillian pulled me out of the gutter and gave me a purpose. "These gentlemen were just admiring the car," she said, her sarcasm so subtle it could cut glass. "I was explaining it's not for sale." Travis straightened, stepping closer to her. He was taller than me, broader too, and the way he moved screamed trouble, slow, deliberate, like a predator sizing up prey. Maybe we ain't asking to buy it, he said, his grin widening. Maybe we just take what we like. The air shifted, heavy with threat. My stomach churned, a mix of fear and something darker, anger, maybe, or the old instinct to fight when cornered. I'd seen guys like this before, back when I ran with a different crowd. They didn't bluff. They acted. Travis, right? I said, stepping between him and Lillian. My heart pounded, but I kept my face blank. You don't want this. Not here. Not with her. He tilted his head, studying me. You her bodyguard or her bitch? Neither. I shot back. Just the guy who'll make sure you regret this. He laughed again, but it was thinner this time, less certain. His buddies closed in, forming a loose semicircle around us. The parking lot felt smaller, the shadows deeper, and I could smell the sweat and cheap cologne rolling off them. My mind raced. Could I take one, maybe two, before they got me? And what about Lillian? She wasn't helpless, but she wasn't a fighter either. Enough, Lillian said, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. She stepped forward, brushing past me, and faced Travis head on. You've had your fun. Now walk away or I call the police. And trust me, they'll be here faster than you can blink. Travis smirked, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe fear. Police don't scare me, lady. They should, she said, her tone ice cold, because I don't bluff. And I don't forget. For a moment, nobody moved. The hum of the 7-Eleven sign buzzed overhead, the only sound in the stillness. Then Travis spit on the ground, inches from her shoes, and stepped back. This ain't over, he muttered, jerking his head at his crew. They slunk off toward a beat-up Chevy parked at the edge of the lot, their laughter trailing behind them like a taunt. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my hands shaking slightly as I handed Lillian her coffee. She took it, her fingers brushing mine, steady as ever. You okay? I asked, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. She nodded, sipping the coffee like nothing had happened. You? Been better, I admitted, glancing at the Chevy as it peeled out of a lot. Who the hell are they? Trouble, she said simply, her eyes meeting mine. There was something there, relief, maybe, or a flicker of respect I hadn't seen before. But we handled it. Together. I didn't know what to say to that. Together. The word hung between us, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to unpack. All I knew was that Travis Boone and his gang had just lit a fuse, and I had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be long before it blew. The ride back to the Escalade felt longer than it should have, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a physical thing. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking under me, and glanced at Lillian as she settled in beside me. Her face was calm, almost too calm, but her fingers gripped the coffee cup a little tighter than usual. The neon glow of the 7-Eleven sign still buzzed behind us, its light spilling through the windshield and painting her features in stark relief, sharp cheekbones, a jaw set, like steel. She looked untouchable, but I knew better. I'd seen the way her shoulders stiffened when Travis got too close. I turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled out of the lot, the tires crunching over loose gravel. Peachtree Street stretched out ahead, a ribbon of asphalt flanked by gleaming high-rises and the occasional flicker of a street lamp. The city hummed around us, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. My hand stayed steady on the wheel, but inside, I was a mess, anger simmering beneath a thin layer of relief, questions clawing at the back of my mind. Who was Travis Boone? Why had he picked us? And why did I feel like this was only the beginning? You're quiet, Lillian said after a minute, her voice cutting through the low drone of the radio. She didn't look at me, just stared out the window at the passing lights, her reflection a ghostly double in the glass. Thinking, I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. A truck swerved ahead, and I eased off the gas, letting the distance grow. That wasn't random, was it? She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, until I thought she might not respond at all. Then she shifted, crossing one leg over the other, and took a slow sip of her coffee. No, she said finally. It wasn't. I risked a glance at her. You know him? Not personally. Her tone was clipped the way it got when she was sifting through what to tell me. But I've heard of him. Travis Boone. Small-time thug with big-time ambitions. Runs with a crew out of East Atlanta. Extortion mostly shaking down shop owners, leaning on anyone who looks like an easy mark. Guess we looked easy, I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel. The memory of his smirk flashed in my head, that cocky tilt of his chin as he'd leaned against the hood. I wanted to wipe it off his face then and now. Lillian's lips twitched, not quite a smile. He miscalculated. Yeah, well, he didn't look too scared when he left. I flexed my fingers, the ache in my knuckles reminding me how close I'd come to swinging. What's his play? He said it wasn't over. He's testing us, she said, her voice dropping lower, like she was thinking aloud, seeing how far he can push before we push back. Men like him don't stop until they're forced to. I chewed on that, the words sinking in slow and cold. The board meeting loomed closer, 10 minutes now if traffic held, but my mind was still back in that parking lot, replaying every move, every word. Travis's threat hung in the air like smoke, curling around us, even here, inside the armored bubble of the SUV. I'd dealt with guys like him before back when I was younger and dumber, running errands for men who paid in cash and bruises. But this felt different. Personal, somehow. Why us? I asked, slowing as we hit a red light. The intersection buzzed with pedestrians, suits, and briefcases weaving through the crosswalk, their lives untouched by the kind of trouble we'd just dodged. He didn't stumble on us by accident. Lillian set her coffee in the console and turned to face me, her eyes sharp in the dim light. Hayes Dynamics, she said simply. We're a target. $1 billion company with contracts the city can't live without. Power attracts vultures, James. Always has. The light turned green, and I eased forward, the engine's growl matching the one building in my throat. So he's after money? Money, leverage, maybe both. She leaned back, folding her arms. He's not smart enough to pull it off alone, though. Someone's behind him, someone with a bigger appetite. That hit me like a punch. I'd assumed Travis was the ringleader, some punk with a chip on his shoulder, and a crew to back it up. But Lillian's words opened a new angle, one I hadn't seen coming. A puppet on a string. The idea made my skin crawl, not just because it meant more players in the game, but because it put her in the crosshairs, and me by extension. You sound sure, I said, turning onto the street that led to Hayes' Dynamics gleaming tower. The building loomed ahead, all glass and steel, a monument to her family's empire. You've got to guess who's pulling the strings? Not yet. Her voice hardened, a rare edge slipping through. But I'll find out, and when I do, they'll wish they'd stayed in the shadows. I pulled into the underground garage, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I nosed the escalade into her reserve spot. The air down here was cooler, tinged with concrete and exhaust, and it sharpened the tension coiling in my gut. I killed the engine, and for a moment, we just sat there, silence pressing in around us. My mind raced. Part of me wanted to storm back to that 7-Eleven, track Travis down, and end this before it spiraled. The other part, the smarter part, knew that'd be playing his game, not ours. James, Lillian said, breaking the quiet. She reached for her briefcase, her movements deliberate. You did good back there, standing your ground. Most wouldn't. I met her gaze, caught off guard by the weight in her words. Didn't feel like I had a choice. You always have a choice. She opened the door, stepping out, but paused, looking back at me. The trick is knowing which one's worth making. She shut the door, her heels echoing as she headed for the elevator. I stayed behind, staring at the dashboard, her words ringing in my ears. Worth making. I'd spent years following her lead, keeping my head down, doing the job. But tonight, something shifted. Travis Boone had lit a match, and whether I liked it or not, I was in the fire now. The question was, how far was I willing to burn? The elevator dinged in the distance, and I grabbed my coffee, stepping out into the garage. The meeting was minutes away, but my focus was already splitting, half on the boardroom, half on the streets. I could still hear Travis's laugh, low and mocking, and feel the weight of Lillian's trust settling on my shoulders. Whatever came next, I knew one thing. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was mine too. The morning after the 7-Eleven run-in, the air in Midtown Atlanta hung heavy with humidity and the faint tang of exhaust. I steered the Escalade down Piedmont Avenue, the Hayes Dynamics Tower rising ahead like a glass monolith against the graying sky. Its sleek lines and mirrored windows reflected the city back at itself, a fortress of power that felt more like a cage today. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, the leather creaking under my palms. Beside me, Lillian sat silent, her navy blazer swapped for a charcoal suit that sharpened her edges even more. She was thumbing through a stack of papers, her brow furrowed. But I could tell her mind wasn't on the contracts. It was on last night, same as mine. The board meeting had gone late, all polished smiles and veiled threats over mahogany tables, but I'd barely heard a word. Travis Boone's face kept flashing in my head. Those wild eyes, that jagged grin, like a ghost I couldn't shake. Lillian's warning about vulture circled too, gnawing at me. I'd parked us in the garage at 7:25, escorted her to the top floor, and stood outside the conference room like a sentry while the suits inside diced up the company's future. By the time we'd left at midnight, the streets were empty, and I'd half expected to see that beat-up Chevy lurking in the shadows. It wasn't there. Not then. Now, though, as I swung the SUV into the drop-off lane outside Hayes Dynamics' main entrance, the tension clawed back up my spine. The plaza was alive with the usual weekday bustle. Executives in tailored coats, assistants juggling coffee cups, the hum of glass doors sliding open and shut. I scanned the crowd, my pulse ticking up, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way the light hit the concrete, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Or maybe it was just me, wound too tight after last night's taste of trouble. James, Lillian said, her voice pulling me back. She'd gathered her papers into her briefcase and was watching me, her green eyes sharp. You're doing it again. Doing what? I asked, though I knew damn well what she meant. My jaw was clenched, my shoulders hunched like I was bracing for a hit, thinking too hard. She snapped the briefcase shut, the sound crisp in the quiet cabin. Relax. We're here now. Whatever's coming, we'll see it. I nodded, but the knot in my gut didn't budge. I cut the engine and stepped out, the humid air wrapping around me like a damp fist. The plaza smelled of wet pavement and overpriced cologne, a stark contrast to the stale grit of that 7-Eleven lot. I circled the SUV to open her door, but she was already out, standing tall and unbothered, like last night was just a footnote. I envied that her ability to lock it all away, to face the day like nothing could touch her. Me, I felt every second of it, the weight pressing down until my chest ached. Meeting's at 9, she said, glancing at her watch. I'll be out by noon. Stay close. Always do. I replied, scanning the plaza again. A guy in a cheap suit lingered near the fountain, his phone to his ear, but his eyes flicked our way, too long for it to be casual. I filed it away, my instincts buzzing. She started toward the entrance, her heels clicking against a stone, and I followed a step behind, my hand brushing the knife in my pocket. Old habits. The glass doors hissed open, swallowing her into the lobby's sterile glow, and I turned back to the Escalade, ready to move it to the garage. That's when I saw them. They emerged from the alley across the street, 3 figures cutting through the morning crowd like sharks through water. Travis Boone led the pack, his hoodie swapped for a leather jacket, but that strut was unmistakable, slow, cocky, like he owned the pavement. His 2 shadows flanked him, the knucklecracker and the quiet one, their faces half hidden under caps. My stomach dropped, adrenaline spiking hot and fast. Not here, I thought. Not in broad daylight, steps from her empire. I froze by the driver's door, keys biting into my palm, and watched them close the distance. The plaza's noise faded, the chatter, the traffic, the fountain splash, until all I heard was my own pulse hammering in my ears. Travis stopped 10 feet away, his grin splitting wide as he locked eyes with me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, letting the moment stretch until it hurt. "Morning, Jimmy," he drawled finally, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd. "Nice day for a drive, huh? What do you want, Travis?" I kept my tone flat, but my body coiled, ready to move. The knife felt heavier in my pocket, a lifeline I didn't need. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the concrete, and tilted his head. "Thought I'd drop by. See how you and the lady are holding up after our little chat." His eyes flicked to the tower behind me, then back. "She in there now? Playing queen. Walk away," I said, stepping forward to close the gap. My voice stayed steady, but inside, I was a live wire, fear and fury twisting together until I couldn't tell them apart. "You're out of your depth." "Am I?" He laughed low and rough, and his boys shifted behind him, their hands flexing. "See, I've been thinking. A ride like that," he nodded at the Escalade, "a suit like her? That's money, power, and I'm a guy who likes to share." The threat hung there, naked and ugly. Extortion, just like Lillian had said. My mind raced, call security? The cops? But that'd take time, and Travis wasn't here for long talk. He was here to push to see if I'd break. I could feel the crowd thinning around us, people sensing trouble and drifting away, leaving us in a bubble of tension that pressed against my skull. "You've got nothing," I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. "You think you can just stroll up here? And what? Scare us? You're a punk with a loud mouth." His grin faltered just for a second, and I saw the flash in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or something colder. He took another step, close enough now that I could smell the cigarettes on his breath. "Keep talking, Jimmy. See where it gets you." My hand twitched toward my pocket, but before I could decide, a shadow moved behind me. Heels clicked sharp and fast, and then Lillian was there, stepping between us like a blade slicing through the standoff. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, just faced Travis head on, her briefcase dangling from one hand like a weapon she hadn't decided to use yet. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice ice over steel, "you're persistent. I'll give you that." Travis blinked, caught off guard, and I felt a jolt of relief cut through the haze. She shouldn't be here. She was supposed to be upstairs, safe behind glass and guards. But damn, if she didn't look like she owned this moment too. "Lady," he started, recovering his smirk. "You got balls coming out here, save it." She cut in, her tone so sharp it could have drawn blood. "You're on my turf now. One call, and the police haul you off before you can spit on my shoes again. Test me if you want." The air went still, the threat sinking in. Travis's boys shifted, uneasy, but he held his ground, staring her down like he could will her to back off. I tensed, ready to lunge if he moved, my heart slamming against my ribs. Fear clawed at me, not for me, but for her. She was fearless, but fearless got people killed. Then he laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a tough one, huh? All right, we'll play nice. For now." He stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender, and nodded at his crew. "See you around, Jimmy. You too, Queen." They turned and melted into the crowd, their shapes blurring into the morning rush. I let out a shaky breath, my knees weak under me, and turned to Lillian. She was watching them go, her face unreadable, but her knuckles were white around the briefcase handle. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice hoarse. "I had it." "No, you didn't," she replied, meeting my eyes. There was no judgment there, just a quiet certainty that steadied me. "But you would have tried. That's enough." I didn't know what to say to that. Relief washed over me, cool and sweet, but it tangled with something else, respect, maybe, or the slow burn of trust one hadn't felt coming. She'd stepped in, not because I'd failed, but because we were in this together now. The thought settled deep, heavy, and real. "Come on," she said, turning toward the tower. "We've got work to do." I followed, the plaza's noise rushing back around us. But my mind stayed on Travis. He backed off, sure, but that for now echoed like a promise. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. And as I watched Lillian's back, her spine straight and unbroken, I knew I'd have to figure out how far I was willing to go to see it through. The lobby of Hayes' dynamics swallowed us whole as we stepped inside, the glass doors hissing shut behind us with a sound that felt final, like a vault ceiling. The air was cool and sterile, heavy with the scent of polished marble and the faint hum of wealth, ceiling-high windows, sleek black furniture, and a receptionist who didn't even glance up from her screen as Lillian strode past. My boots echoed too loud on the floor, a clumsy counterpoint to the sharp click of her heels. She didn't slow down, her charcoal suit cutting a straight line toward the elevators, and I trailed her, my pulse still hammering from the Plaza showdown. Travis's for now looped in my head, a taunt I couldn't shake like a splinter lodged too deep to dig out. The elevator doors slid open, and we stepped in, the mirrored walls throwing back our reflections, her poised and unbreakable. Me, tense and shadowed, my jaw tight enough to ache. I caught her eye in the glass, and for a split second, something flickered there, concern, maybe, or a question she didn't voice. The doors closed, and the car jolted upward, the numbers ticking off floors with a soft ping that grated on my nerves. I wanted to say something, to ask what she thought Travis's next move would be, but the words stuck in my throat. She'd handled him out there, turned his threat into a retreat with nothing but her voice and a look, and I felt small next to that. Small but tethered, like her strength was a rope I could grab onto if I didn't let go. "Stop it," she said suddenly, her voice low but firm, snapping me out of my spiral. She didn't look at me, just kept her eyes on the climbing numbers 15, 16, 17. "Stop what?" I asked, though I knew she'd caught me stewing again, second-guessing. She turned her head slightly, her profile sharp against the steel wall. "You're replaying it, wondering what you could have done different. It's a waste of time." I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. "He's not done, Lillian. You know that." "I do." The elevator slowed, settling on 22 with a soft chime, but neither are we. The doors opened onto the executive floor, a world of glass-walled offices and hushed power plays. The carpet swallowed our steps as we moved down the hall, past assistants who nodded at Lillian like she was royalty and eyed me like I was an intruder. Her office loomed at the end, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Atlanta's skyline like a painting, sprawling, jagged, alive with ambition. I'd been in there 100 times, but today it felt different, heavier, like stepping into a courtroom mid-trial. She pushed the door open, and I followed, the space hitting me with its quiet weight. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, broken by shelves stacked with leather-bound books and awards I'd never bothered to read. Her desk dominated the room, a slab of mahogany polish to a mirror shine, and behind it, those windows stretched wide, letting in a flood of gray morning light. I could see the plaza from here, a distant speck of concrete, where Travis had stood minutes ago, grinning like he'd already won. My stomach twisted, a mix of dread and something hotter, anger, maybe, or the first flicker of resolve I hadn't felt coming. Lillian set her briefcase on the desk and turned to me, her arms crossed. "Close the door." I did, the latch clicking shut with a sound that felt like a line being drawn. The room went still, the hum of the building fading until it was just us, the air thick with unspoken stakes. She didn't sit, just stood there, her gaze pinning me in place. "He'll be back," she said, her voice steady but edged with something new, tension, maybe, or a crack in that iron calm. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and he won't come alone." I nodded, leaning against the wall, my arms folded to keep my hands from shaking. "You think he's got someone bigger behind him. You said that last night. I'm sure of it now." She stepped around the desk, her fingers brushing the edge like she was grounding herself. "That little show out there? Too bold for a street punk with no backing. He's a dog on a leash, James. The question is who's holding it." I chewed on that, my mind racing back to the plaza, Travis's cocky strut, the way his boys moved like they'd rehearsed it. It fit. He wasn't smart enough to target Hayes' dynamics on his own, not without a push. Someone inside? I asked, the thought hitting me cold. The board. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, staring out at the city, her reflection faint against the glass. Maybe, she said finally, or a competitor. Someone who knows what we're worth and wants a piece. I've made enemies, James. You don't build this. She gestured vaguely at the room. The tower, the empire, without stepping on toes, the weight of that settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I'd known she played in a brutal game, contracts worth millions, deals that could sink entire companies, but hearing it like this raw and real made my chest tighten. I wasn't just her driver anymore, her shadow. I was in the crosshairs too, whether I'd signed up for it or not. What's our move? I asked, pushing off the wall. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, and I clung to it, needing something solid. She turned, her eyes locking on mine, and there was again that flicker, sharper now like a spark catching. We don't wait for them to come to us. We dig. Find out who's pulling Travis's strings before he gets another shot. I nodded, but inside I was reeling. Digging meant risks, poking into corners where people didn't want you, stirring up trouble that could bite back. I'd done it before back in the old days, but that was small-time stuff, debts and grudges, not billion-dollar stakes. This was different, bigger. And yet, standing there, watching her silhouette against the skyline, I felt a pull I couldn't name. Not just loyalty, not just fear. It was hunger, raw and untested, waking up in my gut. I wanted to hit back, to prove I could stand in this fight, not just beside her, but with her. Before I could answer, a shadow moved outside the glass wall, a figure pausing by the door, then stepping away. My pulse kicked up, instincts flaring, but it was just an assistant, clipboard in hand, disappearing down the hall. I let out a breath, cursing myself for jumping. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, and I could almost hear Travis's laugh echoing from the plaza below. Lillian didn't miss it. You're scared, she said, not accusing, just stating like a fact. Yeah, I admitted meeting her gaze, but I'm here. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded, a faint curve tugging at her lips. Not a smile, but close. Good, because I need you to be. The phone on her desk buzzed, shattering the moment. She glanced at it, her expression hardening, and picked it up. Yes. A pause, then 5 minutes. Tell them I'm on my way. She hung up, grabbing her briefcase. Meeting's starting. Stay close, James. I'll need you after. I nodded, watching her head for the door, her stride as sure as ever. Alone in the office, I walked to the window, staring down at the plaza. It was empty now, the crowd swallowed by the morning rush, but I could still feel Travis out there, lurking like a storm on the horizon. My reflection stared back at me, eyes harder than I remembered, and I clenched my fists, the ache in my knuckles grounding me. Scared, sure, but fear wasn't the only thing driving me now. Something else was taking root, something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. 2 hours later, I was back in the Escalade, idling in the garage when my phone buzzed. Lillian's name flashed on the screen, and I answered fast. Yeah. Get up here, she said, her voice tight. Now. I didn't ask why, just bolted for the elevator, my heart slamming against my ribs. The ride up was a blur, the numbers ticking too slow, and when the doors opened, I found her waiting in the hall, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. She didn't say a word, just handed me a business card, her own, crisp and white, with Lillian Hayes, CEO, stamped in bold black. On the back, scrawled in jagged ink, were 2 words, "You're next. Where'd this come from?" I asked, my voice rough, the card trembling slightly in my hand. Slipped under my door during the meeting, she said, her tone clipped. Travis was here, James, in the building. The words hit like a fist. He'd gotten past security, past the cameras, right to her door, and left this. A threat, a promise, a middle finger to everything she'd built. My mind raced, fear clawing up my throat, but beneath it, that hunger flared hotter. He wasn't just testing us now, he was daring us. What do we do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. My hand curled around the card, crumpling it, and I felt the shift inside me. Fear giving way to something sharper, something ready to cut. "We fight," she said, her voice steel. "Starting now." I nodded, the weight of it settling deep. Travis had just turned this into a war, and I was done running from shadows. Whatever came next, I'd face it head on, because she needed me to, and because I needed it too. Weeks had passed since Travis slipped that card under Lillian's door, but the air in Atlanta hadn't lost its edge. The city buzzed on, oblivious to the war brewing beneath its surface, while I felt it in every shadow, every sidelong glance. I drove the Escalade through downtown that evening, the streets slick with rain, the neon signs bleeding color into the wet asphalt. Lillian sat beside me, her face lit by the glow of her phone, her fingers scrolling through emails like nothing had changed. But it had. The card, asterisk your next asterisk, sat in my jacket pocket, a crumpled weight I couldn't shake. We weren't just targets now, we were prey, and Travis was circling closer. I turned into the parking lot behind Hayes' Dynamic Satellite office, a squat brick building tucked between a bank and a diner. It was after hours, the lot nearly empty save for a few scattered cars glistening under the sodium lights. We'd come to grab files Lillian needed for a late-night strategy session, something about a merger she wouldn't let die, even with Travis breathing down our necks. The rain tapped a steady rhythm on the roof as I killed the engine, the silence inside the SUV heavy with the hum of unspoken stakes. 5 minutes, she said, unbuckling her seatbelt. In and out. I nodded, stepping out into the drizzle, the cool, wet air biting at my face. The lot smelled of oil and damp concrete, a faint tang of grease from the diner next door cutting through. My boots splashed in shallow puddles as I scanned the perimeter, habit now after weeks of looking over my shoulder. Lillian's heels clicked behind me, sharp and steady, but I felt the tension coiling in my gut. Something was off. The shadows stretched too long, the quiet pressed too hard. Then I saw it, a glint of metal near the dumpster, a flicker of movement. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I turned just as headlights flared to life across the lot. A black pickup roared out from behind the bank, tires squealing as it swung wide and cut us off, blocking the path to the building. The doors flew open, and there he was, Travis Boone, stepping down into the rain, his leather jacket slick and gleaming. His boys followed, the knucklecracker and the quiet one, their faces shadowed under hoods. But I knew their shapes by now, the way they moved like wolves behind him. Evening, Jimmy, Travis called, his voice carrying over the patter of rain, thick with that mocking drawl. "Fancy meeting you here." I stepped in front of Lillian, my pulse a dull roar in my ears. The rain plastered my hair to my forehead, trickling cold down my neck, but I barely felt it. "Get back in the truck, Travis," I said, my voice steady despite the shake of my hands. "You don't want this." He laughed, a low, jagged sound, and took a step closer, his boots splashing in the puddles. "Oh, I think I do. See, I've been patient. Gave you time to figure out who's boss. But you and the lady here, you don't listen." Lillian moved beside me, her presence a quiet heat against the chill. "You're wasting your breath," she said, her tone cutting through the rain like a blade. "Walk away or I make the call. You know how this ends." Travis tilted his head, rain dripping off his jaw, and grinned wider. "Call whoever you want queen. Tonight's different. Tonight you pay." The words hit like a fist, and I saw it then, the shift in his eyes, the glint of something feral. This wasn't a shakedown anymore, it was personal. My mind raced, why here, why now? But there was no time to unravel it. His boys fanned out, closing the gap, and I felt the lot shrink around us, the brick walls and wet asphalt boxing us in. My hand twitched toward my knife, but Travis was faster, lunging forward with a snarl, his fist aimed at my chest. I dodged, barely, the air whooshing past me as I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the slick ground. Lillian shouted something, my name. Maybe, but it drowned in the rush of blood in my ears. I swung wild, my knuckles grazing Travis's jaw, and he staggered, spitting into the rain. The knucklecracker charged. Next, a blur of hoodie and fists, and I took a hit to the ribs that knocked the wind out of me. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but I stayed up, shoving him back with a grunt. James, Lillian's voice broke through, and I turned just as Travis grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the truck. Fury surged, drowning the fear, and I lunged, slamming into him shoulder first. We hit the ground hard, water splashing around us, and I pinned him, my knees digging into his chest. His breath wheezed out, but he grinned up at me, teeth bloody from my earlier hit. "You're dead, Jimmy," he rasped, his hands clawing at my jacket. "You and her both." I reared back to hit him again, but Lillian's hand caught my wrist, stopping me cold. She stood over us, soaked and steady, her briefcase dangling from her other hand. "Enough," she said, her voice low but iron. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card, hers, crisp despite the rain, and flicked it at Travis. It landed on his chest, stark white against the black leather. "Take it," she said, her eyes locked on his. "And think hard about what happens next. You don't know who you're dealing with." Travis stared up at her, his grin fading, replaced by something I couldn't read. Anger, maybe, or a flicker of doubt. The rain hammered down, blurring the edges of the moment, and I felt the shift, the air thinning as his boys hesitated behind us. He swiped the card off his chest, crumpling it in his fist, but he didn't move, just lay there breathing hard. "Get out of here," I growled, climbing off him, my ribs throbbing with every word. "Now!" He pushed to his feet, slow and deliberate, and wiped blood from his lip. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the fire in his voice was dimmer now, cracked. He jerked his head at his crew, and they piled back into the truck, the engine roaring as it peeled out, taillights fading into the wet night. I stood there, panting, the rain washing the heat from my skin. Lillian's hand brushed my arm, steadying me, and I met her eyes, dark, fierce, alive with something I hadn't seen before. Respect, maybe, or trust forged in the muck of that fight. My chest ached, not just from the hit, but from the weight of it all. The realization that I'd kill for her if it came to that, and the regret that I hadn't ended it right then. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, rain streaking her face. "Yeah," I lied, nodding toward the building. "Let's get those files and get out of here." She didn't argue, just followed me inside. The cards echo, asterisk your next asterisk, hanging between us like a ghost. Travis had backed off, but Lillian's move had bought us time, not safety. And as I shook the water from my jacket, I knew the truth. This was bigger than him, bigger than us. Someone wanted her down, and they'd just shown their hand. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The rain had stopped by the time we pulled into the downtown parking lot that night, but the air still hung heavy, thick with the scent of wet asphalt and the faint metallic tang of the city settling into itself. I eased the Escalade into a spot near the edge, the tires hissing softly against the damp concrete, and killed the engine. The lot was a sprawl of shadows, hemmed in by the jagged silhouettes of office towers and the distant hum of late-night traffic on Peachtree. Lillian sat beside me, her briefcase resting on her lap, her face half lit by the sodium glow of a flickering street lamp. She'd been quiet the whole drive from the satellite office, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the leather, and I hadn't pushed her to talk. After Travis's last stunt, leaving that crumpled card on his chest, I figured we both needed the silence to think, to brace for whatever came next. "Files are secure?" I asked, breaking the quiet as I unbuckled my seatbelt. My voice sounded rougher than I meant it to, scraped raw by the tension that hadn't left me since the fight. She nodded, patting the briefcase. "Locked in here. Let's just get home." I stepped out, the cool night air biting at my damp jacket, and circled to her side, scanning the lot out of habit. The place was nearly deserted. Half a dozen cars scattered across the rows, their windows dark, a lone security light buzzing overhead. My boots crunched against loose gravel, the sound too loud in the stillness, and that familiar twitch climbed my spine. Something felt off again, same as it had weeks ago outside that brick building. I chalked it up to nerves, to the way Travis's threats had burrowed under my skin, but I kept my hand near my pocket anyway, the knife a cold comfort against my thigh. Lillian stepped out, her heels clicking sharp against the pavement, and I shut the door behind her. The lot stretched out around us, a gray expanse broken by pools of shadow, and I caught the faint glint of something moving near the far end. A trick of the light, maybe, or a stray cat. I shook it off, turning to lock the SUV when the roar of an engine shattered the quiet. Headlights blazed to life 50 yards away, cutting through the dark like a blade. A black pickup, the same damn one from the satellite office, lurched forward, tires squealing as it barreled toward us. My heart slammed into my throat, and I grabbed Lillian's arm, yanking her back as the truck skidded to a stop, blocking our path to the exit. Dust and gravel sprayed around us, the air thick with the stench of burnt rubber. Doors flew open, and Travis Boone stepped out, his leather jacket gleaming under the street lamp, his grin wide and vicious. His boys followed, 3 this time, Knucklecracker the quiet one, and a new face, taller, with a scar snaking down his neck. They fanned out, slow and deliberate, boxing us in against the escalade. Well, Travis drawled, his voice a low rasp over the idling engine. Told you it wasn't over, Jimmy. I pushed Lillian behind me, my pulse a wild drumbeat in my ears. The lot felt smaller now, the walls of the surrounding buildings pressing in, the shadows twisting into traps. My ribs ached from the last fight, a dull throb that sharpened with every breath. But I squared my shoulders, facing him down. "You're a broken record, Travis," I said, keeping my tone flat despite the heat clawing up my chest. "What's it this time?" He stepped closer, boots scuffing the concrete, and stopped just out of reach. His eyes glinted, wild and unhinged, like he'd been chewing on this moment for weeks. 10 million, he said, the words dropping like stones. Cash, unmarked, by tomorrow night, or you're both done. The number hit me like a punch, so absurd I almost laughed. 10 million. It was insane, beyond insane, but the way he said it, calm and certain, turned my blood cold. Lillian tense behind me, her breath hitching, but she didn't speak. I could feel her calculating, weighing the threat, same as I was. This wasn't a shakedown anymore, it was a declaration. He wasn't here to scare us, he was here to bury us. "You're out of your mind," I shot back, stepping forward to close the gap. My voice rose, cracking with the strain I couldn't hide. "You think we're just gonna hand you a fortune? You're a punk, Travis. A nobody." His grin didn't falter, but his hand twitched, dipping into his jacket. "Nobody, huh?" he said, pulling out a switchblade, the steel catching the light as he flicked it open. "We'll see who's nobody when I carve that pretty face of hers up. Or maybe I start with you." The air went still, the threat sinking in deep. My stomach churned, fear and fury tangling until I couldn't tell them apart. I glanced back at Lillian, her face pale, but her jaw set, her eyes locked on Travis like she could burn him down with a look. She wasn't running, wasn't breaking, and that steadied me, lit a spark in the dark mess inside my head. I turned back to him, my hand sliding to my own knife, the weight of it grounding me. "Try it," I said low and hard. "See how far you get." He laughed, a sharp bark that echoed off the buildings, and lunged. I sidestepped barely, his blade slicing the air where I'd been, and swung my fist into his gut. He grunted, doubling over, but the scar-faced one charged me next, slamming me against the escalade. Pain exploded in my back, the metal cold and unforgiving, and I gasped, swinging blind. My knuckles connected with his jaw, a sickening crunch, and he staggered back, cursing. "James!" Lillian shouted, and I spun just as Travis grabbed her, his arm looping around her neck. She thrashed, slamming her briefcase into his shin, but he held tight, dragging her toward the truck. Rage roared through me, white-hot and blinding, and I launched at him, tackling him to the ground. We hit the concrete hard, my elbow cracking against the pavement, and I pinned him, my knife at his throat before I even registered pulling it. "Get off her." I snarled, pressing the blade until a thin line of blood welled up. His eyes widened, that grin finally gone, replaced by something raw. Fear, maybe, or the first crack of doubt. His boys froze, hands half raised, and the lot went quiet, the only sound my ragged breathing and the distant drip of water from a gutter. "Let her go, Travis." I said again, my voice shaking with the effort to keep it steady. Or I end this right now. He stared up at me, chest heaving, and for a moment I thought he'd call my bluff. I wasn't sure it was a bluff. My hand trembled, the knife biting deeper, and I felt the edge of something dark inside me. Something I hadn't touched since the old days. Killing him would cost me everything, Lillian, my freedom, whatever shred of decency I had left. But in that second, with her life on the line, I didn't care. I'd do it. I'd pay the price. Then a new sound cut through, a low growl of another engine, headlights sweeping across the lot. Tires screeched, and a beat-up sedan skidded to a stop yards away, the driver's door flying open. A figure stepped out, tall and lean, his face shadowed until he moved into the light. Marcus Reed, my old mentee, the kid I'd pulled out of the streets years ago, now a man with a Glock in his hand and a look that said he'd seen worse than this. Drop it, Boone, Marcus called, his voice steady, the gun trained on Travis's crew. You're done. Travis's eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to me, the fight draining out of him. Who the hell? He started, but I pressed the knife harder, silencing him. Let her go. I said, each word a hammer blow. He shoved Lillian away, and she stumbled, catching herself against the escalade. I eased off him, my knife still out, and stood, my legs shaking under me. Marcus advanced, his gun steady, and Travis's boys backed off, hands up, their bravado crumbling. Lillian straightened, brushing her hair back, her eyes blazing as she stepped beside me. You okay? I asked, my voice hoarse, my gaze darting between her and Travis, who was scrambling to his feet. Yeah, she said, her hand finding my arm, a brief anchor. You. I nodded, but my chest was tight, regret and relief crashing together. I'd almost killed him, would have, if Marcus hadn't shown up. And now, here was Marcus, the past slamming into the present like a freight train. I hadn't seen him in years, not since I'd left that life behind. But the sight of him steadied me, a lifeline I didn't know I needed. Been a while, James, Marcus said, his eyes flicking to me, a faint grin tugging at his lips despite the tension. You still picking fights you can't win? Looks like I won this one. I shot back, but my voice cracked, gratitude bleeding through. Thanks. He shrugged, keeping the gun on Travis. Heard some chatter about Boone. Figured you might need a hand. Travis spit blood onto the concrete, glaring between us. This ain't over, he muttered. But it was weaker now, a hollow echo of his earlier threats. He jerked his head at his crew, and they piled back into the truck, the engine roaring as it peeled out, taillights vanishing into the night. The lot went still again, the adrenaline draining out of me, leaving my hands trembling. I sheathed my knife, my ribs screaming with every move, and turned to Lillian. Her face was flushed, her suit rumpled, but she held my gaze, something fierce and unspoken passing between us. We'd survived, barely, but the cost was piling up, and I could feel in my bones. 10 million, she said, quietly, her voice steady despite everything. He's not working alone. That's not his number. I nodded, the weight of it settling deep. Marcus stepped closer, holstering his gun, and clapped a hand on my shoulder. Whoever's behind him, they're playing hardball, he said. You're in deep, man. Yeah, I said, meeting his eyes, then hers. But I'm not out. Lillian's lips curved, not a smile, but close. Neither am I. The three of us stood there, the night pressing in, and I felt the shift, fear, giving way to something harder, something forged in that fight. Travis had pushed us to the edge, but we weren't broken. Not yet. And with Marcus here, the odds had just tipped. The war wasn't over, it was heating up, and I was ready to burn. The night air clung to me as we stood in the parking lot, the echoes of Travis's truck fading into the hum of the city. My chest heaved, ribs throbbing with every breath, the taste of blood and rain still sharp on my tongue. Lillian's hand lingered on my arm, her touch a quiet tether in the chaos, and Marcus stood a few feet away, his Glock now holstered, his posture loose but alert. The street lamp buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows across the wet concrete, and for a moment the three of us were a still frame, survivors of a storm that wasn't done with us yet. I wiped the rain from my face, my hand shaking as the adrenaline ebbed, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. The lot felt vast now, the buildings looming like silent judges, their windows dark and unblinking. Police sirens wailed in the distance, faint but growing louder, a pulse that matched the one hammering in my skull. Travis was gone, for now. But his words hung heavy, 10 million, a number too big for a thug like him to dream up alone. Lillian was right. Someone else was pulling the strings, and they'd just raised the stakes to a level I could barely fathom. You sure you're okay? I asked her again, my voice rough, my eyes searching hers. Her suit was soaked, her hair plastered her face, but she stood tall, unshaken, or at least pretending to be. I knew her well enough by now to spot the cracks, the way her jaw tightened when she was holding something back. I'm fine, James, she said, her tone clipped but steady. She brushed a strand of hair from her eyes, her fingers leaving a faint smear of dirt on her cheek. You took the worst of it. I snorted, wincing as the movement jolted my ribs. Yeah, well, I've had worse. A lie, maybe, but it felt good to say it. To pretend I wasn't rattled down to my bones. Marcus stepped closer, his boots scuffing the pavement, and I caught the faint grin tugging at his lips. Still the same old James, he said, his voice low, familiar in a way that tugged at memories I'd buried deep. Charging in like you've got nothing to lose. Had to, I shot back, meeting his gaze. His eyes were older now, harder, but I could still see the kid I'd pulled out of a busted-up bar fight 7 years ago, the one who'd followed me like a shadow until I'd cut him loose to find his own way. Didn't expect you to show up, though. How'd you even know? Word travels, he said, shrugging. Heard Boone was sniffing around Hayes' dynamics. Figured it'd find you sooner or later. He glanced at Lillian, then back at me, a question in his look I didn't want to answer yet. You're in deep, man. Deeper than I thought. Before I could respond, the sirens swelled, red and blue lights slicing through the night as 2 patrol cars screeched into the lot. Tires skidded on the wet concrete, doors flew open, and uniforms spilled out, flashlights cutting through the dark. My stomach lurched, relief, sure, but tangled with dread. The law showing up meant safety, but it also meant questions, exposure, a spotlight on a fight I wasn't sure we could explain. Hands where we can see 'em. A cop barked, his voice sharp over the crackle of radios. I raised mine slow, palms out, and Lillian followed, her briefcase dangling from one hand like a shield. Marcus holstered his gun with a practiced ease, stepping back to let the officers take the lead. We're the victims here, Lillian called out, her voice carrying the boardroom authority, unshaken even now. They attacked us. Black pickup, 3 men, maybe 4. They're gone, but not far. The lead cop, a stocky guy with a buzz cut and a badge that read Sanchez, lowered his flashlight, squinting at her. You Hayes? He asked, recognition flickering in his eyes. The CEO? Yes, she said, stepping forward, her heels clicking against the pavement. And this is my driver, James Carver. We were ambushed. Extortion attempt. $10 million their demand. Sanchez's eyebrows shot up, but he nodded, jotting it down on a pad. Description: tall, leather jacket, goes by Travis Boone. I cut in, my voice steadier now. 2 others, one with a scar on his neck, another built like a linebacker. They've been tailing us for weeks. The cop grunted, waving his partner over. Radio it in. Black pickup, suspect Travis Boone. Get a bolo out. He turned back to us, his gaze lingering on me, then Marcus. And you are? Marcus Reed. Marcus said, hands still up, his tone calm but edged. Private contractor. Old friend of James. Got here just in time. Sanchez studied him, then nodded. But I could see the wheels turning, too many players, too messy a scene. The other cops fanned out, sweeping the lot with their lights, their radios spitting static and clipped commands. My chest tightened as the reality sank in. This wasn't just our fight anymore. The law was in it now, and that meant a reckoning, whether we were ready or not. You 3 stick around, Sanchez said, holstering his flashlight. We'll need statements, and if Boone's who you say he is, we'll find him. He's not alone, Lillian said, her voice low, meant for me as much as Sanchez. Someone's backing him. This wasn't his idea. The cop frowned, but before he could press her, a shout cut through the noise. Over here! One of the officers called, his light pinned on something near the edge of the lot. We turned, and my gut twisted as I saw it, a glint of metal in the shadows, half hidden by a dumpster. A switchblade, its blade still open, smeared with blood. Mine or Travis's, I couldn't tell, but the sight of it hit me like a punch. Evidence. A tether to the violence I'd almost let consume me. Sanchez crossed to it, crouching to bag it, and I felt Lillian's eyes on me, sharp and searching. You didn't, she started, then stopped, reading my face. No, I said, my voice hoarse. I didn't kill him, but I would have. She nodded, a flicker of something, relief, maybe, or understanding crossing her face. Good, she said softly, because I need you here, not behind bars. Marcus clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. You're still in one piece. That's what counts. I managed a shaky laugh, but it died fast as the sirens faded and the lot grew still again, the cops' lights painting the night in stark reds and blues. The air smelled of rain and tension, thick with the weight of what we'd dodged and what we hadn't. Travis was out there, wounded but alive, and whoever was behind him wasn't done. $10 million. A demand that screamed power, not desperation. My mind raced, chasing shadows. Someone on the board? A rival CEO? The possibilities gnawed at me, each one uglier than the last. Let's get this over with, I muttered, nodding toward Sanchez, who was waving us over for statements. My legs felt heavy as I moved, the ache in my ribs spreading, but I kept my head up, Lillian beside me, Marcus a step behind. We were a unit now, forged in this mess, and that steadied me even as the fear lingered. The statements took forever. Names, times, details I could barely keep straight through the haze of exhaustion. Sanchez pressed for more, his pen scratching loud in the quiet. But Lillian handled it, her voice smooth and precise, weaving the story into something the law could swallow. I stuck to the basics, Travis's threats, the fight, Marcus's arrival, leaving out the part where I'd held a knife to his throat and felt the pull to end it. That was mine to carry, a secret stitched into the cracks of who I was becoming. By the time we finished, the sky was lightening, a gray smear bleeding into the horizon. The cops were wrapping up, their radios buzzing with updates, sightings of a black pickup south of the city, a possible lead. Sanchez handed Lillian his card, told us to call if anything else came up, and then they were gone, taillights vanishing into the dawn. We stood there, the three of us, the lot empty, now except for the Escalade and Marcus's sedan. My hands shook as I fished out my keys, the cold metal biting into my palm. I wanted to collapse, to let the weight of it all pull me down, but Lillian's presence kept me upright, her silence a demand I couldn't ignore. What now? Marcus asked, his voice breaking the stillness. He leaned against his car, arms crossed, watching me like he could see the war inside my head. We find him, I said, the words coming hard and fast, like they'd been waiting to break free. Travis, whoever's behind him. We don't wait for them to come back. Lillian turned to me, her eyes blazing in the dim light. Agreed, she said, her voice steel, but we do it smart. No more parking lot brawls. We dig deep, and we hit them where it hurts. I nodded, feeling the shift inside me, fear burning into resolve, exhaustion giving way to a hunger I hadn't known I had. I'd fought for her tonight, almost died for her, and it wasn't just loyalty anymore. It was something bigger, something that scared me as much as it drove me. Love, maybe, or the jagged edge of it. I didn't have a name for it yet, but it was there, raw and real, binding us tighter than ever. Marcus grinned, a spark of the old troublemaker I remembered. Count me in. Been a while since I cracked some heads with you, James. I laughed, a brittle sound that hurt coming out, and clapped him on the back. Good to have you, man. The three of us piled into the Escalade, the dawn breaking slow and gray around us. The city woke up oblivious, its towers gleaming in the distance, but I could feel the fight ahead, Travis, his puppet master, the whole damn machine gunning for us. My ribs ached, my hands trembled, but my mind was clear. This was war now, and I was done running. Whatever it took, whoever it cost, I'd see it through. Because Lillian needed me, because Marcus had my back, and because somewhere in the blood and rain, I'd found something worth fighting for. The morning sun spilled through the blinds of Lillian's Atlanta penthouse, casting slanted golden bars across the hardwood floor. I stood by the window, coffee mug warm in my hands, staring out at the city sprawling below, towers of glass and steel glinting like they were daring the world to take a swing. The air in the room was still, scented with the faint citrus of a perfume and the sharper edge of brewed dark roast. It was quiet, too quiet after weeks of chaos, and that silence pressed against my chest, heavy with a peace I wasn't sure I deserved. My ribs still ached from the parking lot fight, a dull reminder stitched into every breath. But the tension that had gripped me for so long was gone, replaced by something softer, gratitude, maybe, or the weight of what we'd built from the wreckage. Lillian moved behind me, her bare feet whispering against the floor as she adjusted the collar of her silk blouse. She'd traded the suits for something simpler today, a cream top and slacks that softened her edges, but she still carried that quiet command, the kind that made a room shift when she entered. Marcus sat sprawled on the leather couch across the room, one leg slung over the armrest, flipping through a stack of papers with a grin that said he was half amused, half proud. The marriage license lay on the coffee table between us, ink still fresh, waiting for his signature as our witness. It was real now, me and Lillian, bound by more than just survival. And the thought settled deep, warm and steady, like a fire catching after too long in the cold. "James, you're brooding again," Lillian said, her voice teasing but soft as she stepped beside me. She brushed a hand against my arm, her fingers lingering, and I caught the faint sparkle of the ring on her left hand, a simple band, no fuss, just like we'd wanted. It glinted in the sunlight, a quiet promise. "Not brooding," I replied, turning to meet her eyes. They were green and sharp, same as always, but there was a warmth there now, a depth that hadn't been so clear before Travis turned our lives into a battlefield. Just taking it in. She tilted her head, studying me, and I knew she saw it, the shift in me, the way the fight had carved something new into my bones. I wasn't the same man who'd driven her to that 7-Eleven months ago, tense and uncertain, a shadow clinging to her light. I'd face Travis down, knife to throat, and come out the other side, not unbroken but stronger for it. And her? She'd stood with me, unyielding, her strength a mirror to my own. Together, we'd turned fear into something solid, something worth keeping. "All right, lovebirds," Marcus called, his drawl cutting through the moment as he waved the pen like a baton. "Let's get this official before I change my mind and demand a toast first." I laughed, a sound that felt lighter than it had in weeks, and crossed to the couch, Lillian beside me. The penthouse stretched around us, all high ceilings and clean lines, a far cry from the rain-soaked parking lots and grimy alleys where we'd fought to stay alive. The walls were bare save for a single framed photo, a shot of the three of us outside Hayes Dynamics the day after Travis's arrest, bruised but grinning, the tower looming behind us like a trophy we'd earned. It was home now, this place, not just hers but ours, and that hit me harder than I expected. Marcus scrawled his name across the witness line with a flourish, his handwriting jagged but sure, and slid the paper toward us. "There," he said, leaning back with a smirk. "You're stuck with each other now. No refunds." "Thanks, man," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. My voice caught, just for a second, and I saw the flicker in his eyes, the understanding of what his showing up that night had meant. He'd pulled me out of the dark once before years ago, and now he'd done it again, gun in hand, a brother I didn't deserve but couldn't imagine losing. Lillian picked up the license, her fingers tracing the edges, and smiled, a real one, small but unguarded. "You're stuck with us too, Marcus," she said, her tone dry but warm. "Don't think this gets you out of family dinners." He groaned, theatrical and loud, but the grin stayed. "Fine, but I'm bringing the cheap beer. None of that fancy boardroom stuff." The laughter came easy then, filling the room, and I felt the last knot in my chest unravel. We'd made it, through Travis's threats, the fists and blades, the shadow of whoever had pulled his strings. The cops had nabbed him that night, tires squealing as they boxed in his truck south of the city, his boys scattering like rats. He'd gone down swinging, spitting curses as they cuffed him. But it was over. The switchblade, the blood, the $10 million demand, it was all evidence now, locked in some precinct vault, tying him to a cell he wouldn't walk out of anytime soon. The mastermind behind him? Still a ghost, a question mark we hadn't answered, but the heat was off for now, and that was enough. I sank onto the couch beside Marcus, Lillian settling next to me, her shoulder brushing mine. The warmth of her pressed against me, steady and real, and I let my hand rest on her knee, the ring on my finger catching the light. Outside, Atlanta hummed on, horns blaring faint through the glass, a city that didn't care about the war we'd won. But in here, it was ours, a victory carved from the muck, a life we'd chosen when the dust settled. You ever think about it? Marcus asked, his voice quieter now, his eyes on the skyline beyond the window. What you do different? I leaned back, exhaling slow, the ache in my ribs a dull echo. Every day, I admitted, could have called the cops sooner, could have walked away from that first fight, but then I glanced at Lillian, her profile sharp against the morning light, and felt the words catch in my throat. Then I wouldn't be here. She turned to me, her hand finding mine, her grip firm. Neither would I, she said, and the weight of us, settled deep, a truth we didn't need to unpack. We'd faced Travis together, bled together, and come out stronger for it. That was the story, not the what-ifs. Marcus nodded like he got it and stood, stretching with a groan. Well, I'm not one for speeches, so I'll leave you, too, to the honeymoon vibes. Call me if Boone's ghost shows up. He won't. I said, more certain than I felt. Travis was locked up, his crew fractured, but that shadow lingered. The one Lillian had warned about, the puppet master we hadn't unmasked. It gnawed at me a loose thread, but I pushed it down. Today wasn't for that. Today was for us. Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, tossing a salute over his shoulder. Take care, Carver. You too, Mrs. Carver. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room went still again, just me and Lillian, the license on the table, a quiet testament to what we'd become. I turned to her, my chest tight, with something I couldn't name. Love? Sure, but bigger, rawer, forged in the fire of everything we'd survived. You okay with this? I asked, my voice low, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Me, I mean, all of it. She shifted closer, her hand sliding up to my jaw, her thumb brushing the scar Travis's fist had left weeks ago. James, she said, her voice soft but sure, I didn't marry you because it was easy. I married you because it's right. The words hit me like a wave, washing away the last of the doubt. I leaned in, kissing her slow, tasting coffee and the faint salt of her skin, and felt the world shrink to just us. The penthouse, the sunlight, the steady beat of her heart against mine. Outside, the city roared on. But in here, it was quiet, a peace we'd earned the hard way. When we pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine, her breath warm on my face. What now? She asked, echoing Marcus's question, but softer, laced with possibility. I smiled, the first real one in too long. Whatever we want, I said and meant it. Travis was gone. The fight was over, and the future stretched out ahead. Ours to claim, ours to build. The ghost in the shadows could wait. For now, we had this room, this moment, this life, and it was enough. The sun climbed higher, painting the floor gold, and I held her close, the ache in my ribs fading to a memory. We'd fought for this, bled for it, and won. And as I looked out at Atlanta, the city that had tested us and let us stand, I felt a flicker of something new. Hope, bright and unyielding, burning through the scars.